Comparison is the thief of joy. You've probably heard or seen this. It pops up everywhere, pinned on Teddy Roosevelt, even though nobody can find where he said it. And the advice implied is always the same. Just stop. I talked to several researchers who spent their career in this area. Not one of them thinks you can.
If we didn't do any social comparison, then we would not be human.
We all do it from time to time.
Every emotion has a useful function, even if it's a negative emotion.
We're the descendants of our prehistoric ancestors who did the best job of being liked and accepted and respected by other people.
The advice to stop is useless because the comparison was never optional to begin with. What we do get to choose, though, is what and who we measure ourselves against. And lately, someone else has been doing the choosing. But I talked to one psychologist who, unlike a lot of the discourse out there, doesn't blame the phones.
There's like a correlation between depression symptoms and how much time you spend in bed, but we don't blame the bed for the depression, right?
We can't help but compare what other people think of us, because it's in our wiring as human beings. Mark Leary is a professor emeritus at Duke, who spent his career on exactly that.
Human beings are rather fragile and weak and frail animals. We don't have fangs, we don't have claws, we can't run away fast, we can't fly away, we can't climb trees. The only way we survived is that we bonded with other humans. If you weren't contributing to the group, if you were incompetent, if you weren't very nice, they were going to kick you out. They might even kill you.
Losing the group could get you killed. So we come from the people who watch their standing very closely, which is Leary's best known idea, what self-esteem is actually for.
Our self-esteem is a monitor or a gauge of other people's reactions to us, of the degree to which they value us.
So is quantifying likes, followers, comments just a contemporary supercharged way of seeing if we're accepted by the tribe?
No, I think that's it. Now we have a whole lot of other ways to get that information. We feel good when we get that, and we feel bad when we don't, just like we feel bad when other people are ignoring us in person.
The instinct is ancient, and it kept us alive. What you can ask is how this comparison is being fed now, because that part changed. For almost all of human history, our comparison pool was very small. You knew everyone in it, and you saw their bad days up close.
We probably lived with the same group of people our entire lives, just 30 to 50 people.
So what happens to us in our brains when we see millions upon millions of people online every single day?
In the digital age, it's almost infinite now. There could be millions of people evaluating you both in good and bad ways, and our brain is not prepared to deal with that.
So from 50 people to millions, working with mostly the same brain matter. Jacqueline Nesi, an associate professor of psychiatry at Brown, studies how the design of these platforms affects our social lives.
Our interactions tend to be much more public. They're quantified, so we're getting, a certain number of likes or views or whatever it might be. Social comparison can be, in many cases, amplified.
None of that was your choice. But it was a choice. Somebody else designed it. Nesi told me about a teenager who noticed.
She was like, yeah, I just wish that it wasn't every time I opened the app, I didn't have to look at my face right away. Right? That's such a design choice, right? It doesn't have to be that way.
And what's on everybody else's profiles isn't their life. It's just a presentation of it. Erin Vogel is a social psychologist at the University of Oklahoma, who wrote one of the founding studies on this back in 2014.
We don't see their bad days. We see the glamorous photos of their vacation. We don't see all the flight delays and when the whole family was mad at each other. Those parts just get kind of glossed over.
And what's being pushed on these feeds isn't accidental.
The platforms are designed to be addictive. That is just how they're made. So features like endless scrolling, endless content, it's designed to make us kind of always think that there's something good around the corner.
The cost that worries me most isn't a bad mood. It's that all this comparison quietly rewrites what we want to begin with. Niels van de Ven is a professor of consumer psychology at Tilburg University, and he studies exactly this.
You see the comparisons of people having a product or showing a product, but it also sets a norm about things that can be expected, what is normal in your position to have. It's the comparison, the expectations that drives these things.
Usually where these videos on self-comparison stop is to just convince viewers to delete the apps or brick your phone. The whole comparison is the thief of joy sentiment. But one researcher has spent years arguing that this whole social media is dooming us story runs ahead of the actual science. Candice Odgers is a psychologist at UC Irvine, and probably the most prominent skeptic of the idea that phones are destroying a generation. I didn't bring her in to nod along, But she started by acknowledging the particular sensitivity to social comparison that adolescents face.
When kids hit puberty and they start to move through early adolescence, they start to make more and more comparisons between themselves. So they begin to actually feel the hierarchy.
What she won't grant is that phones explain the mental health crisis. I asked what else could account for depression and anxiety rising since the late 2000s.
It's been going up since 2008, youth suicide in the United States. So what else happened in 2008? There was a Great Recession, so an economic shock that hit families. It would be like statistically impossible for one factor to explain an increase in a complicated disorder like depression or anxiety, right? Like that would just not be plausible. Science doesn't sell these days, but it's the truth.
And she's not exactly the outlier here. Every researcher in this video studies these harms for a living, and they take a nuanced approach to their conclusions.
I really share the concern about social media. I do think that the really sensationalized headlines about social media wrecking a generation or ruining our kids are a little bit overblown.
Odgers had a warning aimed at people like me, who make content about how bad this all is.
We tell them that that's like shameful, that they're addicted, that there's something wrong with them, that their brains are damaged. I mean, that is just not a recipe for supporting young people.
In fact, younger generations, on a lot of the old measures that used to scare parents, are doing better than the people panicking.
On many metrics that matter, if you look at this generation, you see that they're actually doing better. Lowest rates of alcohol use that we've seen in decades, violence has been falling, teen pregnancy has been falling. Like these were huge, costly problems that when I started my career working on them, these were the things we were trying to reduce and help young people avoid.
So we're left holding two things that are both true. Social comparison is real, and it can do damage, and the apocalypse isn't in the data. If social comparison is harmful to you, what can you actually do about it? Vogel makes the point that you don't choose whether you compare. You choose who you compare yourself to.
The key to making social comparison work for you really is to choose your comparison target, the person you're comparing yourself to wisely. If you're looking up to a celebrity who maybe has access to a private chef and wanting your body and your appearance to look like theirs, that goal is not going to be attainable, and it's going to ultimately make you feel worse about yourself. But if you look at somebody who's pretty similar to you and you want to achieve a goal that they've achieved, looking at how they did it can be really, really helpful.
Randa Ven's advice isn't to fight the feeling, it's to read it.
Use that signal. You get a signal that apparently this is something that you value. So see that as a information where you can use and then think about why is it something that you value, what aspect of it is it that you value.
There's a piece I feel I have the most stake in here. All this comparison gets narrated by a voice inside your head that you develop as you grow up. Mine hasn't been kind for a while.
Growing up, I was told to value and practice humility. And I think eventually for me, there became a type of overcompensation where I couldn't really, tell the difference between self-compassion and, maybe just feeling good about yourself when you shouldn't, or excusing yourself for bad behaviors. So can you distinguish the difference between what you're espousing and what might be just arrogance or denial?
Yes. Yeah. Self-compassion is simply treating yourself nicely. I like to think of it as how would you treat a loved one, a best friend, a romantic partner, a family member in this situation? So you have a family member who's beating themselves up. They're saying, oh man, I'm so stupid. I just messed this thing up so bad. Nobody likes me. You wouldn't go, well, yeah, that's right. You're really awful. If we said to other people verbally the things we say to ourselves about ourselves in our mind, if we said it to them, to their face, we'd be hated by everybody. We'd be an awful person. So why is it okay to beat ourselves up and to feel awful and lie awake at night, but it's not okay to do that to other people?
That specific reframing, how would you talk to a loved one about the thing you're beating yourself up over, is what unlocked the idea of self-compassion for me, after years of resenting even the idea of it.
I find in my own head that I kind of narrate it sometime, almost like I'm doing a play-by-play sports broadcast of my life, and I'm evaluating whether this was a good play or that was a bad play. And if we would just do that a little less, I think it would calm us down some.
To be honest about where I sit, I make videos that score every aspect of their performance. Every single time I upload, a birth of numbers tells me how I did against everyone else who uploaded that day. And if I wanted to find out, it could tell me how I did compared to everyone else who has uploaded anything ever. Whatever part of my brain that evolved to track my standing in a group of 50 is now being pointed at YouTube analytics, and I can't tell the difference. Now, I think I'm handling it so far, but extrapolate that similar dynamic to everyone else with their various online personas on their various online platforms. You can't think that that's harmless to us as a species. Odgers' main claim is that the youth, at least, the generation that grew up inside all this, are dealing with it better than we think.
Don't believe the things you read about this generation is more narcissistic. They look a lot better than we did. You all look a lot better than we did. And so stop letting people tell you that you're not.
Comparison isn't the thief of joy. It's a tool. And we don't have to let it get the best of us. But for the first time in human history, that tool has been handed to powers that directly profit when they use it against us.